An atheist pissed on a Bible to challenge God, and then Jesus made him tremble. I say that not as a headline or an exaggeration. I say it because I stood in that sanctuary under the June rain, and I watched it happen with my own eyes. The rain sounded like a drum on the church's tin roof. It was one of those nights when the air feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. We had gathered for a midweek prayer meeting at Resgate Church in Pinheiros. Maybe 30 people, mostly older members and a handful of younger faces. The pulpit lamp was on. The Bible on the altar lay open to Job 38. You know that chapter. It's God's answer when everything in Job's life has been shredded. It's a question that cuts through complaint like a blade. Where were you? It felt strangely apt that evening. The page caught the lamplight and trembled because someone had left the window cracked and the rain blew in little cold drafts. I'm Thago. I was pastoring that church at the time. I'd been a pastor for years, but that night felt like the kind of moment you carry with you for the rest of your life, not because of spectacle, but because of what it revealed about grief, fury, the human heart, and God's stubborn mercy. He walked in soaked to the skin, hair plastered to his forehead, shoes leaving damp footprints down the aisle. People later told me they recognized him at once. Rafael Augusto Mendez, a cardiologist who had once led worship in another church. He'd been a man everyone admired, skillful with a stethoscope, gentle with a hymn, steady when parents needed counsel. He was not unknown to us. He had been in our city's hospital circuit and in the polite, reserved circles where people spoke quietly about his loss. But that evening, under the rain, he came like a verdict. You need to understand who Raphael was before you can understand what pushed him to do what he did. Loss hit him like a series of blows that never stopped falling. First came Julia. She was his wife. Young, bright, a missionary who had gone to Mozambique with a team from our church several years before. They married with songs and a shared calling. She had a way of laughing that lit a room and of praying for strangers. The illness she contracted there moved faster than any of us expected. It was over in months. Raphael told me, sometimes in the early days, how he'd held her hand, and how the missionary hospital where she died smelled of antiseptic and dust and salt from the ocean. He told me he had prayed until his voice broke. For a man who trusted medicine with his hands, the loss of Julia felt like medicine had failed God himself. Then came Gabriel. He was 4 when he drowned at a church retreat. I remember the day the news came to me. I still remember the sound of that call. A child lost at an age when the world should still be full of scraped knees, cartoons, and bedtime stories. The church where the retreat took place was small and desperate in that moment, wrestling with first aid, with calls to the family, with the gravity of a child slipping into the deep. There are things you cannot fix with clinical expertise. Raphael could not resuscitate what had left him, and the scent of chlorine at that pool is something that stayed with him like a bruise. And then there was Donna Helena, Raphael's mother. A missionary for decades, she had outlived many of her generation and had spent her last years quietly praying for the city from a small armchair. A stroke took her into a coma, and the family had to decide about life support. Those are decisions that do not sit on anyone's lap lightly. People told me later that Raphael had stood like a pillar through the funeral, but grief is a porous thing. It seeps into every corner of a life. At some point, when the child-sized shoes had been put away and the home echoed in the way houses do after the people have gone, his faith began to unravel. When the losses piled up, it was not so much that Raphael lost faith in God. What happened was more precise and more brutal. He lost his sense that God was moral in the old covenant way he had been taught. He could not reconcile the God who heals and the God who allows a daughter to die, a son to drown, a mother to slip away under machines. Anger became his lodestar. It shaped his nights, his words, his decisions. The man who had spoken about providence on television began to say, in private and then in public, that he no longer believed. Doubt grew teeth and became a weapon. He stopped attending services, unfollowed every pastor on social media, and once, when someone asked, he answered with a laugh that had something like venom in it. God took everything from me. The community tried, in the slow, weary way of people who do not know how to fix each other, to reach him. I visited him once or twice. He would speak in clinical terms about death, about probability, about randomness. He brought me a coffee made in a machine that hummed like a hospital monitor. He listened politely. He told stories about the surgeries he'd performed and the lives he'd saved, as if to say, "Look, I know the order of things. I know how to control what can be controlled." Then, when the conversation turned to Julia or Gabriel, his voice would go dry. His hands would fidget with the edge of the cup like he was grasping for something to hold. It was not overnight. It was a slow cooling of the heart, like a hearth going out during winter, a process that left him colder and more determined. He began to speak of God as an absent landlord who had robbed him of his home and had the audacity to expect loyalty. He read books on atheism not as a scholar, but as a man seeking a companion for his sorrow. The thing that made people uneasy was not that he doubted. It was that his doubt turned performative. He wanted not just to stop believing, but to show the world that belief was meaningless. So when he walked into our prayer meeting that June night, there was an air of waiting as much as of fear. People had seen him in the neighborhood, at memorial gatherings, sometimes walking past the church like a ghost seeking its old life. But no one expected what came next. He did not slip quietly into a seat. He came to the front. The word he spoke first was simple and raw. If there is a God, let him show himself. He set his wet hands on the Bible that rested on the altar. The book had been used in baptisms, in marriages, in funerals. That cover had held the imprint of many hands, some trembling with gratitude and some heavy with sorrow. Raphael's fingers were steady when he flipped the pages. He forced a kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "This book promised me an afterlife for my child, for my wife, for my mother. Where were they? Where is this God?" His voice scraped against the brick walls. I remember the sound of a chair being pushed back, someone standing, a woman saying softly, "Lord." I remember the smell of rain and wet wool. I remember thinking in an almost indifferent way that pastors sometimes adopt to steady themselves, that the church is supposed to be a place where the worst of humanity airs itself. I also felt, with the clarity that shock brings, that this was not merely a rhetorical challenge. It was a deliberate performance. He tore a page out of the Bible. He did it in a methodical, almost clinical way, like a man performing an experiment to see if there was any reaction. It was the page that still bore the faint pencil mark where someone had underlined a verse years earlier after a funeral. He let the page flutter on his palm, and then, with a contemptuous laugh, he wet his hand and let the urine begin. I will not linger on the imagery. It is enough to say what happened. He desecrated the page. It was an act of aggression aimed more at the God he believed had failed him than at the congregation. People gasped. Some turned away. A small child started to cry. For a moment, there was only the sound of rain and the small, panicked breath of people caught between fury and bewilderment. What did I do in that instant? There were 1,000 thoughts racing like birds against a storm window. Pastoral instinct says you intervene, to protect, to comfort, to stop the sacrilege. But there was something else I felt first, a stillness like a pressure change in the heart of the room. I had been taught to discern, and I have learned over the years to listen for the Spirit's lead in moments that feel like the night's thickest part. I felt the air change, not metaphorically, not in some vague sense. The temperature seemed to dip. The lamplight looked like it sat on a different plane. I did not rush forward. That decision is something I would later explain in many ways, always with the humility of a man who knows how easy it is to get it wrong. At the moment, I found myself uttering short, private prayers under my breath. There is a kind of prayer that does not form words so much as asks God for eyes to see, for ears to hear. I asked for protection for the people gathered and for a heart to speak truth with grace. Then he stepped back, looked at the congregation with a face that was both defiant and exhausted, and said with predictable theatricality, "There, see, nothing happened." He meant the critique to land like a verdict. His question was rhetorical and cruel. If nothing happened, then God is silent. If God had no response to his disrespect, then maybe God had no power, no presence, no care. It's a strange thing about provocation. It wants a public audience. It wants a reaction. It wants to expose weakness. And yet the reaction that provocation seeks is often the one that will be interpreted as fear. For Raphael, the absence of thunderbolts or the lack of flame did not constitute victory. His victory was in the spectacle itself, in forcing people to watch him act out the fury that had been his daily companion. He was daring God, and daring us to deny him the catharsis his grief had refused to give him. After he sat down, there was a knot of murmurs. People shuffled in their chairs as if embarrassed by their own breaths. The woman behind me started to cry and quietly left. A few of the younger men edged toward him in protective anger. A couple of them moved to place hands near him, ready to stop anything else he might try. I kept my eyes on him. He was smaller when he sat, not in body, but in the rendering of his posture. The burnished steel of a surgeon's confidence dulled, exposed to the raw nerve of a man who has lost a center. Then something else happened, something I still find difficult to describe without sounding sensationalist, because it is the sort of experience that sits between testimony and mystery. The lights above the altar flickered. Not in the lazy way of old wiring, but in a pattern that felt like a punctuation. 1, 2, 3 flicks, like the blinking of a warning light. The air in the front pews seemed to collect a fog of breath. You could see people's exhales, though the night outside was not that cold. Several people later used the word cold to describe it. I wrote it down in my journal too. A member of the worship team later told me their fingers had numbed. Raphael said afterwards, in the raw way of someone telling what went wrong in a play, that his legs gave way. He said he could not stand. When a man who has spent his life standing over tables of human hearts can no longer stand, something has been altered in the world of his own body. I ran forward then, not because I had decided what to do, but because compassion is faster than thought. I stretched out my hands to him. He fell on his knees, and then, as if on a wire pulled taut, he collapsed face forward onto the carpet. People crowded around. Some reached to lift him. Others were frozen, eyes wide. His face was wet, not with rain now, but with something else. Tears, perhaps, or the residue of humiliation and the body's sudden surrender to the weight of a terror that had been building for years. The sound in the room narrowed to the sound of one man's breath. He began to convulse in a way that scared even the youngest people present. It was not a medical assessment to say that. It was simply the human reaction to seeing someone lose control of their muscles, to watch a body that is usually disciplined betray its keeper. I kept calling his name. I put my hand on his back. People later would tell me that some of the older women began to pray aloud in tongues, not because they had suddenly become exotic, but because in moments of desperation, prayer sometimes returns to its most basic ancient form. Raphael kept saying one thing over and over between gasps. "Where are they? Where are they? Tell me where they are." His voice was a thread winding through the room. He wanted a map. He wanted the coordinates of meaning. He wanted evidence that the ones he had loved and lost were somewhere, with someone who had not abandoned them. That question, the echo of Job's question in a way, is the most human of all. Where are those I love? Where is justice? Where is mercy? Then, and I say this carefully because in our age of skepticism and scientific rigor, I am keenly aware of the responsibility of speech. Raphael reached up with a shaking hand and gripped a fragment of the wet page he had taken. His fingers closed on the paper. He started to whisper words that were not his native tongues. They were syllables like a river finding a new channel, rising and breaking into speech that did not belong to his usual vocabulary. He told me later he was not making them. He could not explain them. That night, in the sanctuary lit by a flickering lamp and the stubborn glow of people's phone screens, a man who had come to disprove God seemed to be touched by something beyond his own anger. Before I move on, and there is still so much more to tell, I want to pause and say this plainly. I do not mean to present this as a template or to suggest that every atheist who speaks against faith will be met with dramatic signs. That would be untrue and irresponsible. Grief wears many faces. God's ways are not a predictable machine. But I am obligated to report what I witnessed. A man who had come to punish a book, or perhaps punish the God he felt had punished him, broke down in a way none of us expected, and something in that room shifted. If this is gripping for you, stay with this testimony through to the end. Subscribe so you don't miss how this night reshaped more than just one life. I ask that not as a marketing line, but because the arc of this story matters. What began in defiance did not end in spectacle. It opened a sequence of events that changed a city, redirected a vocation, and I believe opened a door for many who are standing in valleys of their own. We wrapped him in a coat. We led him to the side room that served as a makeshift office and prayer space. I remember how his hands continued to tremble like someone trying to hold onto a ledge. When we sat him down, his eyes were open, but not the same eyes I had seen at memorial services or in hospital corridors. There was a rawness there, a childlike hunger that looked for a parent. He reached for a chair, clung to it, and said through ragged breaths, I cannot see them. Tell me how I see them. I sat with him for a long time. There were practical things to do: get him water, call a friend, reassure the rest of the congregation. And there were harder things: to wait with humility, while someone's soul unstitched. He spoke. Not coherently at first, but in fragments that broke my heart, pieces of dreams for his son, the scent of his wife's hair on a humid night in Mozambique, the line of his mother's hands when she had laid them on his head and prayed over him as a boy. The weight of grief pressed each memory like a hand on a wound that would not close. At one point, he lifted his face to me and asked simply, "Did they see Jesus?" It was not a theological test. It was the cry of a man who wanted to know whether the people he loved were safe. I remember answering him the only way I could. With tenderness and with the Bible, I had not yet moved from the altar. "I believe they saw him," I said, and then I added a humility-bent sentence. "I believe he was with them in the way we hope for, but do not always understand." He nodded, and then closed his eyes, as if to put that possibility like a stone in his pocket. We sat like that until the building felt emptied of its initial outrage and filled instead with something quieter, like a tent folded and tucked away. People left slowly. Some of them stayed to pray. Some walked home in the rain in stunned silence. The sanctuary had the smell of damp wood and old hymn books. The open page of Job 38 was still there, wrinkled and wet on the altar. I did not touch it. Something about letting that page be felt sacramental, as if leaving it undisturbed was an act of respect for the violent question that had been hurled at God and the softer, hurt question that had followed. Later that week, I visited Raphael's apartment. It was tidy in the manner of a man who likes things arranged. A cardiologist's home, framed medical certificates on the wall, a few photographs of him with Julia on a sunlit beach. a small wooden boat model that had belonged to his mother, Donna Helena. The photos looked like evidence of a life ordinary and sacred at once. He had a plaster on his thumb, where he had accidentally cut himself earlier in the week. Little details like that make people feel whole, even if the interior life is in pieces. Our conversations moved from polite to raw. He told me he had read every book on grief and on disbelief that he could find. He had come to our church that night not merely to challenge, but to test the very idea of consolation. "I wanted proof," he said, in the deadpan manner of a physician who asks for lab results. "I wanted a sign, a phenomenon, something measurable." We talked about ethics and about the problem of evil, those old philosophical behemoths that, when carried alone, crush the lungs. We talked about memory, about the way a child's laughter can become both balm and knife. He asked questions that had no answers that would satisfy him, and he admitted that some nights the questions turned to anger that felt delicious because it was an action. Over the next days, he did not return to unwavering antagonism. He wavered between fury and a kind of stunned bewilderment. He called me at odd hours. He showed up at the church sometimes just to sit in the pews. Once he bowed his head in a corner and remained there for a very long minute. He began to come to the hospital where he worked as a doctor with a different air, quieter, as if the previous certainty with which he moved through patients had been softened by something he could not yet name. People asked me whether that night had been a miracle. Others wanted a label. The world loves labels because labels tidy the unruly mysteries into manageable boxes. I would say this instead. It was an encounter. It was a moment when grief, provocation, longing, community presence, and something beyond our full comprehension overlapped in the smallest of rooms. It was not an event that solved every question, and it was not an event that erased the necessity of therapy, of long nights, of daily acts of faith and discipline. It was, however, the beginning of a trajectory that would ask Raphael to re-examine everything he had sworn off. There is more to tell. How the night deepened into visions, how Raphael's repentance unfolded in public, how the congregation wrestled with forgiveness and with the practical Christian duty to restore someone who had desecrated what we hold dear. There are details about the cleaning and consecration of the altar, about the way the church community rallied, about the slow work of therapy, and of a man who would later sell his clinic to establish a fund for grieving families. There are harder things too: resistance, skepticism, the temptation for sensational retelling that I will return to. But for now, let me close this part of the story with one image that will not leave me. The Bible on the altar, open to Job 38. Its pages darkened by rain and desecration, and the man who had come to prove God's absence now kneeling on the worn carpet, both hands on the hem of the pulpit, his body trembling in a way that made him look like a man who had been stripped of all pretense and was suddenly, painfully human. That night began the unmaking of a hardened heart. It also began, though it would take months and years to see, the slow remaking of a life poured into a new shape. The next moments after the collapse are what most people want to hear, whether there was a vision, what he saw, whether he received assurance that his loved ones were safe. What happened in those first minutes inside the church, and what came in the days that followed, are what I will tell next. What happened next is the part that changed everything, and I will tell it as plainly as I can, because what followed was not a neat miracle that fits into a headline. It was messy, tender, terrifying, and in the end, merciful. After he collapsed, the room was full of hands and prayers. We put a blanket around his shoulders, pressed a cup of water into his hand, and tried to steady him. For a long time he simply lay face down on the carpet, as if the weight of the world had finally found the one point on his body that could no longer hold it. Then, slowly, he pushed himself onto his knees, and in a voice that had lost all performance, began to speak. He described, later in more measured words, what he claimed to have seen. I do not speak of this as a man trying to prove anything to skeptics. I relay it because I sat beside him on that floor and listened while he told me of images that kept returning to him in the weeks after the night in our church. The first image he spoke of was of Julia. He said he saw her as she had been before illness, took the light from her face, laughing, hair loose, a smear of sun on her cheek. Raphael told me he could smell the small, bright perfume she used to wear. He said it was like citrus and salt, the scent of a woman who had spent time by the ocean. In his vision, she stood in a wide field that was not a field he could name. It felt like every safe place he had ever known compiled into one. She looked at him, not with the flicker of accusation he had expected, but with a tenderness so steady it made him weep. He told me that Gabriel was there too, not the small, helpless child after the accident, but a boy with eyes that laughed even in the memory of loss. Raphael said Gabriel reached for him, smiled as children do when shame has not yet taught them manners, and that the boy's hands were unscarred and warm. When Raphael described that smile, a silence fell over the room that felt almost like a divine pause, the kind of hush that lets you know a truth is touching the tenderest part of you. And his mother, Donna Helena, appeared to him in the way people who have prayed for decades often appear in visions, composed, hands folded as if in the middle of blessing, voice like a hymn. Raphael said she placed her hands on his head and spoke words in Portuguese, the same prayers she had said over him when he was a child. He said he felt in that touch the continuity of his life threaded through generations of faith and care. He insisted again and again that he had seen not only them, but an overwhelming sense that they were with Jesus. He used that phrase, they were with Jesus. He said he felt like a wave on the skin, the assurance that their endings were not betrayals but arrivals. He told me he heard, not with his ears at first, but as a conviction that became sound, a voice that was not condemning. He could not quote words, because the experience was more like a warmth settling around the memory of those he loved. But he came out of it convinced they were safe in a way he could not have proven before. He said the sight of them at peace was what dissolved his performative rage. I want to be careful here about language. I interviewed him weeks later in the church office, with a notebook between us, and the rain hitting the window again like a metronome. I asked him, "Did you literally see them?" He answered slowly, "I don't know how to explain it. It was as real as the chair beneath me, and at the same time it felt like something I had dreamed and been handed the next morning as proof." He used the word real, and then he added, "But it was also mercy." You will notice, perhaps, the theological tension. An atheist bent on disproving, a scene of desecration, and then an experience that pushes him toward belief. That is not a tidy triangle. It is jagged. It is made of human habit and divine mystery. We must not, as a community of faith, claim that dramatic visions are the norm or a test every grieving person must pass. The Bible itself warns against glib interpretations of heavenly signs. Yet we are also a people who record eyewitness testimony. I was there. I heard him. I watched the way the man who had left the altar with contempt returned the next morning with hands that trembled for a different reason. After the immediate collapse and the first hours of shock, the church became a place of literal and spiritual triage. We did practical things first. Someone called a close friend of Raphael's and asked him to come sit. We placed him in the side room where there was a couch and some silence. We shut the sanctuary doors and left the altar as it had been, wet, wrinkled, a single page stained where the act had occurred. A few of the older women washed their hands and sat in the corner, praying in low voices. That night the church was quieter than it had been in years. In the morning the altar needed care. We had to address the desecration without making it into an idol of scandal. We gathered a small team, people who had been at the meeting and those who could help clean and consecrate without making a theatre of it. We wrapped the torn page in cloth and laid it in the ground behind the church beneath a small marker, as one would treat a relic of sorrow. We did not burn it in a spectacle. We did not flaunt it. We buried it with a prayer, and with the knowledge that desecration, while hateful, did not define the book itself for us. The altar was washed with clean water, the wood cleaned, the hymnals aired and reshelved. We prayed over the space and asked for grace, not as a mechanical reset, but as a communal reorientation toward love and hospitality. Raphael did not want the church to make him a spectacle, and we tried to honor that. But stories do not remain locked in a small congregation. In the weeks that followed, the paper trail of that night found its way to cameras and to articles that recited, with varying degrees of accuracy, what had happened. Some outlets painted him as a villain. Others treated the night like a cheap morality play. Both responses were useless to him, and both were a temptation to us as a church. He sought help. This, to me, is one of the most important facts of the story. Whatever realms his experience touched, he agreed to engage the long and necessary work of restoration. It would be both irresponsible and theologically dishonest for me to suggest that a single night fixed everything. Grief is not a puzzle solved by the revelation of a fact. Healing is a discipline as much as it is a gift. Raphael began to meet with a therapist recommended by members of our congregation, a counselor experienced in complex grief. He sat in group therapy with men who had lost children, wives, parents. He began, slowly and stubbornly, to write down memories that had been sharp as flint and to hold them in his hands like fragile glass. He also came to the church to pray, not to perform, not to challenge, but to sit in the back and listen to people speak honestly about how life can be both harsher than faith and sustained by it. We developed a plan together. We created a short-term schedule for him that mixed clinical help and pastoral care. He came to morning prayers when he could, not because he wanted to be seen, but because the rhythm of prayer was, for him, a scaffolding as he rebuilt his life. 2 months later, he confided to me that the memory of that night still startled him. The feeling of his body giving way, the rawness of seeing what he had once thought would be enough to shut the world down. But that those images of his family had become, paradoxically, points of comfort rather than triggers. He told me the phrase, "they were with Jesus," had started to be less of a sentence and more of a practice. He remembered them as present to God, and that remembrance did something tender to the hollow places inside him. There came a public moment of reckoning. Several members of the congregation urged him to stand and speak, not in a performed confession, but in a frank account of what he had done and what he had felt. The city press had already caught wind of the story. A tabloid photographer came to the church one Sunday and was refused entry. We did not stage a confession to placate the cameras, but 6 months after the June night, Raphael walked to our pulpit during a morning service, not as a man looking for absolution in front of strangers, but as a man who had decided to be transparent. He began haltingly. He described the loss, the anger, the desecration. He did not ask us to applaud. He did not seek to explain every motive. He simply told the truth of what had happened and said, "I am sorry." Then he told us what he had seen, again with the caveat that he could not make a scientific claim, only his testimony, and how that vision had turned something in him. He said that seeing his family at peace had not erased their deaths, but had reframed them. Then he said the thing that made some of the older women in the front row begin to cry, "I want to use whatever I have left to help those like me." What followed from that decision was a vocational reorientation. Raphael did not abandon medicine in a theatrical move. He sold his private clinic over the course of the next year, and with the proceeds established a small fund in our church dedicated to helping families who had lost a child or a spouse. He organized a retreat program for grieving parents, assisted with hospital bills in small, practical ways, and used the money to pay therapists for those who could not otherwise afford help. He also began attending evening shifts at the city hospital, not as the commanding cardiologist he had once been, but as a chaplain-type presence, offering a hand, a word, listening to families in sterile waiting rooms while the fluorescent lights hummed above. His work in the hospitals, and I raise this carefully because hospitals are complex places, was not a spectacle of miracles. It was a ministry of presence. He sat with people who held phones that displayed photographs of lost loved ones. He learned to say, "Tell me about them," and to keep the conversation anchored in memory rather than in platitude. He would bring a pot of coffee sometimes. He would sometimes read scripture when requested. Sometimes he simply listened. The fruit of that work was not always visible in conversions or headlines. Its fruit was quieter, a father who wept for the first time in public and felt less alone. A nurse who could breathe again because someone had acknowledged how hard it was to hold grief and work a night shift. There were also public, unmistakable fruits. On more than one occasion, families whose lives Raphael had touched came to our church and asked to be connected to the community. People who sat in the back of our services and listened to his testimony in small groups later stood to say they had encountered Christ through the way he now lived. But I must repeat what I have said before. We do not make universal promises. Not everyone who hears a testimony is saved. Not everyone who is present at a conversion in the press experiences life-reshaping faith. The work of restoration is, by definition, gradual and uneven. One scene remains iconic in the narrative of those years, Raphael's rebaptism. It took place on a bright morning beside a small pool that the church used for baptisms. The crowd was not huge. It was mostly family, friends, and a handful of people who had been at the night where he had desecrated the Bible. There were tears and awkward laughter as people remembered how broken things had been. He wore a simple white shirt, and when he stepped into the water, his body did not make a show so much as an offering. As he went under the water, many of us felt the symbolic weight of that act. The old man, who had been bent by anger and grief, submerged, and a new person emerging. He came up laughing in a way that was not the venomous laugh of his earlier days, but the surprised, relieved laugh of someone who had been given a second chance. He spoke to the congregation afterward, brief and humble. "I am not fixed, I am not without pain, but I have a new work to do." The room responded not with naivete, but with solidarity. We did not pretend his life had been reset to zero. We acknowledged the scars and the ongoing process. Over the next 2 years, the fund he established, called simply the Harbour Fund, supported dozens of families. We organized memorial art pieces, a wooden boat installed in the church courtyard with small plaques commemorating lost children and spouses. Raphael commissioned one carpenter, a grieving father himself, to craft footprints in wood for families who wanted a small place to place a photograph. He got a tattoo, too, a simple outline of a small boat, not as a mark of permanent perfection, but as a reminder of the night that began his change. Those who pressed him about the tattoo asked if it was a conversion gimmick. He smiled and said, "It is ink for memory. It is my way of saying I will not forget the debt of what I did and what I lost." There was resistance. Some in the broader Christian community were uneasy about the attention paid to the supernatural elements of his return. They worried we were promoting spectacle. Others in the secular press used him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religion. That tension kept us honest. We refused to commercialize the story. We refused to monetarily benefit from sensationalizing his transformation. We insisted on transparency. The Harbour Fund published yearly reports of how money was spent. We opened the fund to independent oversight by a small council that included a therapist and a hospital social worker. The most decisive thing to me is not the headlines or the artifacts, but the slow shape of his heart. In the first months he still flinched at hymns that had been sung at his son's baptism. A year later, he organized a support group for fathers who had lost children and convened it in his former clinic, a place where death and life had often crossed paths in his hands. He trained in pastoral visitation and began, with permission from hospital authorities, a small program of visits to the pediatric ward where families sat through nights of uncertainty. He learned to sit with the silence. He learned to refrain from giving easy answers. He learned to honor anger as legitimate while gently inviting stories toward hope. There were moments that felt like full circle. I remember a woman, a stranger, who met him in the hospital corridor and said, "I read about you. I thought you were cruel." He listened, and she continued, "But you sat with me the night my son was ventilated. You brought me a blanket, and you didn't say a single word that tried to fix me. You just let me cry." That remark, more than any sermon, seemed to mark the heart's conversion from spectacle to service. Theologically, we were cautious about interpretations. We did not build a doctrine around one man's vision. We read the scriptures soberly. We reminded the congregation that the Christian story is not that God meets rare, sensational acts with spectacle, but that God entered our suffering in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus is not a God who stands apart from grief. The gospel insists he enters into it. The prodigal motif helped us frame the event. A human who wanders into anger and alienation is pursued by a father who longs to restore. Yet we also insisted that restoration requires confession, repentance, and the discipline of community. 16 months after the night in the church, a small public university invited Raphael to speak on grief and medicine. He accepted not as a returned celebrity, but as someone who had become a conduit for things he had once refused to acknowledge. He spoke frankly about the limits of medical science in the face of existential loss, and about the necessity of community care. He said he was not on a mountaintop of answers, but walking a long road. A student in the back asked him bluntly, "Do you believe now?" He answered, "I believe in what I have seen and what I have experienced. I believe I have been changed, and I try to live into that change." The room applauded, not for conversion fever, but for honesty. The city changed a little because of the Harbor Fund. Our church began to host an annual retreat for mourning families. The retreats were practical: therapy, group sharing, quiet spaces, and spiritual, prayer offered, sacraments respected, memory honored. We saw people who had long refused to enter a church come to these retreats because they were interested in grief support, not religion. Some of them, over months and years, found that faith and care could live together without coercion. There were miraculous-seeming moments, too, small and human. A mother who found courage to speak about her child in public for the first time and felt lighter for it. A father who, after months of isolation, re-entered family life. Nurses who reported fewer incidents of professional burnout because our group had taught them how to process grief as an occupational hazard. These were not headline miracles. They were shifts in human practices toward tenderness and accountability. I will not hide the hard edges. The story had critics who said we were exploiting vulnerability for institutional growth. People asked whether the church had financial motives. We answered with transparency and with work. No one on our pastoral staff personally benefited from the Harbor Fund. All overhead costs went to program logistics. We published statistics about how many persons received grief counseling, how many families were helped with funeral costs, and how many hospital visitations we conducted. The numbers do not prove the goodness of the work, but they do show diligence. There was a spiritual fruit I did not expect. When people who had once mocked our faith saw Raphael's consistent change, the selling of a clinic, the creation of a fund, the patient presence in hospital corridors, some of them began to ask different questions. They asked how a life bent by pain could be turned into a life of service. They asked whether something beyond methodology might ground such a change. That curiosity opened doors. It did not convert everyone. It did, however, compel conversations that were less adversarial and more honest. As for Raphael, the man who once said, "God took everything from me," began to reframe that sentence. He did not say God had given him everything back. He said, "God gave me a place to put what I have left." This phrasing is crucial. It is not an attempt to make suffering into something noble. It is a practical theological insight. God does not always remove the losses. Sometimes God provides a space in which the losses can be repurposed into love. That, to me, is one of the subtlest forms of mercy. I want to bring this story to you now with a few direct questions. If you are carrying a wound, the loss of a spouse, a child, a parent, what is your Raphael moment? Is it a place of anger, where you have tried to make life square with your pain by lashing out? Are you sitting in a sanctuary of your own making, convinced that God has abandoned you? If so, know that your anger is not the final definition of you. Know also, and painfully, that not everyone who reacts in anger will have a dramatic reversal. Many people walk the long road without cinematic signs, but the invitation of the gospel is to bring the rawness of our complaint and place it before God, not as a mockery, but as an honest witness. If you are someone who has witnessed someone else's desecration, whether of faith, of ritual, or of what you hold sacred, ask yourself how your response can hold both justice and compassion. The early church models for us the work of restoration. Galatians speaks of restoring one who has been overtaken in a spirit of gentleness. Though I am not here to quote chapter and verse as a magic wand, the posture stands. Restoration is patient, humble, and communal. And if you are here listening, and you are in the rawness now, I would say this plainly: you need people. You need therapy when the hurt is deep and recurrent. You need community that will not shame you for doubt, but will not coddle you into bitterness. You need rituals that honor loss, not to erase it, but to give it a place. If this story has moved you, do something small and concrete. Share it with someone who is in a valley right now. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and perhaps one name you carry in your heart. We will read them, and, as a church, we will pray for those names. That is the single call I ask you to obey. Before I close, there is one final scene I want to paint for you, because it is the one that I keep returning to. It is not dramatic. It is a morning 2 years after the June night. It was early, the sky barely lit. Raphael came to the church courtyard carrying a small wooden box. Inside were photographs and a toy boat his son had loved. He placed the box inside the wooden memorial boat we had installed, and then he sat on the bench and watched as the first light of day warmed the courtyard. He did not speak to anyone at first. Then a young father approached him and asked haltingly, "How do you keep from breaking?" Raphael put his hand on the young man's shoulder and said simply, "You don't keep from breaking. You learn to hold the cracks so light can get in." I know that sounds like a metaphor, and perhaps it is, but it is also practical theology. The cracks are not the end of the story. They are the places where healing, however slow, begins. So what do we make of a night where an atheist urinated on a Bible and later trembled under the weight of a vision of his lost ones? We make of it a testimony to a God who is not a showman, but who enters suffering with us. We make of it a caution against simplistic explanations and a call to persistent compassion. We make of it an encouragement to the weary to keep coming, to keep seeking, and to allow a community of faith to stand with you. Let us pray. Father, we come with hands that tremble and hearts that ache. You know every loss, every name we carry that we have not yet spoken aloud. Grant us courage to place our anger before you, not as a weapon, but as a wound we cannot heal alone. Meet those who are in the valley with a presence that is tender and real. Give wisdom to those who care for the grieving, counselors, pastors, friends, that they may offer steadiness, not platitudes. For the ones who have seen and touched unexpected grace, keep them humble. For those who doubt, give patient companions. We do not ask for a life without sorrow. We ask for the presence that turns sorrow into service and pain into a pathway toward mercy. In the name of Jesus, who mourned with the mourners, we entrust these prayers to you. Amen. If this testimony touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear that God pursues even the prodigal heart. Tell us where you are watching from, and if you feel safe, a name you carry. We will pray for them. May grace find you in the places you least expect, and may you find a community to hold your cracks so the light can get in.